committee meeting of the fiscal year budgeting. So we have a roll call that you want to walk us through.
Sure, I can do that. Director Calkins? Here. Director Johnson? Here. Director Eisenbeis?
Here.
Director Mueller?
Here.
Director Stegman? Here. Director Wallstrom?
Here.
Director Lane?
Here.
Director Johannes?
Here.
Do not see Director King in attendance.
Was that Director King? Oh, okay. All right. Well, we have out of curiosity, I think Director Stegman may be the only other one that has had the joy of having to operate under the local budget law back at the county and at the city of Gresham, but I don't know if any of the rest of you, Dan, I don't know what you're, okay. Well, just briefly for context, as a local government, we're subject to the Oregon local budget law, which is also a change for most of the staff here because previously the drainage districts were not subject to the local budget law, but almost every local government in Oregon is subject to it. All the counties, all the cities, all the 197 school districts, most of the special districts. And so there's a number of things that Lori has to do in advance of this that are all procedurally based. The local budget law is about 35 pages at ORS 294-305 that is great insomnia therapy, but it's full of rules, regulations, process, procedure. So there'll be sort of a number of things that we may have to do over the course of the budget process that are because of that, not because Lori just decided it'd be fun to make it loose. And part of that process is noticing the meetings still have to be published in that somewhat archaic media form of the newspaper before the budget committee can meet. And so that's been done. Just from a context standpoint, we have a budget committee and it's also our board. We're different than most all of those other local governments. City of Gresham, City of Fairview, Troutdale, Lake Oswego, Milwaukee, any of the ones you want to think about, they're all required to have have budget committees. And the local budget law says those committees have to be the board plus an equal number of citizens. So most of those cities have a 14-member budget committee, which is part of the challenge of cat herding. But we, the county, and the city of Portland, given that we have a TSCC in Multnomah County and our population is over the threshold, we're subject to the TSCC, and they specify that the board serves the role as the budget committee. We still do it as a budget committee because there is so much in those 35 pages that say the budget committee did this back there in their process, and then somewhere else it'll say the end based on the budget committee. So we sort of have to go through the process, even though it's our doppelgangers, on the board are the same. We've sort of got to go through that process, and so we'll be stepping through some of that. The local budget law also specifies that its management is responsible for proposing a budget, which is what this is. The local budget law doesn't expect the governing board or the budget committee to come up with a budget, just to be reviewing it. So you, of course, are welcome to dive in and try and understand it all, but you're not expected to recalculate spreadsheets and schedules and so forth. The practical result of the budget committee is that they have to produce what is referred to as the second budget. This is the first one. The local budget law actually requires 3 budgets a year. This being the first one, the next one is referred to as the approved budget, and it's the budget that's been approved by the budget committee Then there's a whole bunch of more forms that Lori has to fill out and more publications. She has to send money to the newspaper and so forth. And then there's more public hearings. And then ultimately it goes to the board. And that final budget is what's referred to as the adopted budget, which is what then goes into effect July 1st that the district operates under. The district is currently operating on the adopted budget from last July 1st. So just from a work product standpoint, our deliverable as a budget committee is to approve a budget that can then continue through the process. All of that just made me think of simply because we added this item here in terms of nominating me to be the budget committee chair, because both the bylaws that we adopted as well as that local budget law are pretty black and white that say the budget committee is supposed to elect a chair at its first meeting. And even though the board, those people that we're familiar with, may express their preference, the budget committee hasn't met until now. This is our first meeting. So in order to avoid giving any ammunition to the few critics that there are out there of the district, we'd rather not have anything that they can point to say that we didn't follow the rules. So with that, I would ask for the indulgence of someone to make that motion, and unless of course someone else would like to be chair. And
I nominate Eric Mueller. I second.
any other nominations? Okay, not hearing any, we'll just do a voice vote. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, thank you. We've got that taken care of. Well, now that I've chewed up some of Lori's valuable time, we'll move on to one of the other duties of the budget committee, which is it specifies in the local budget law that they are to receive the budget message from the district. So Lori, it's all yours.
Start quickly and then hand it over to Jan. So good afternoon. Today we'll be presenting the proposed budget for the urban district for fiscal year 2025-2026, which feels a little odd, but yes, we're moving into 2026. You will see today that our budget balances general fund revenues and expenditures at $18.9 million, preserving fund balance, and also utilizes restricted funds to support some project costs. You'll also see the assumptions in the budget, including salary increases, assessment revenue rate increases, and increases to the flood safety. I'm going to hand things over to Jim Medoff. Thank you, Jim.
Lori, thank you, Mr. Chair. Jim Medoff, for the record, Executive Director. I want to start today by letting you know that Lori has a lot of really important information to share with you. And so we have scheduled a follow-up meeting on April 9th to give you more time to ask questions and dig in. Would also share with you that if you want to meet individually with Lori or send an email or a phone call to get your questions answered, we will track all the questions we receive and share them back out with the answers to everyone on the board so that everyone has the same knowledge. But please let us know, and you can look forward to April 9th. So if you're anxious about the time today, you can breathe. We'll get all your questions answered. With that, I want to remind you all that this budget is a really big deal. And it's a big deal because, candidly, the first year budget that we're operating on was the result of the interim board. This is the first elected and appointed board dealing with a budget. We have learned a lot in our first year of operations. And I think the thing that really struck me as I was thinking about this meeting is that this budget is really the result of a decade of collaboration and hard work compromised by cities, the county, metro, the port, 3 sessions of the Oregon legislature, 3 signings by the Oregon governor, an act of Congress, and just a lot of really hard work by a lot of volunteers and staff. And that whole effort was aimed to get us here today, where this district that provides such an important function has sustainable revenue and the ability to operate the system in a way that the community expects. So I want to remind you that we are standing on the shoulders of a lot of people who have worked really hard to get us here. And now it's our opportunity to implement all of that hard work to fix this district up. It's really a demonstration of our community's ability to do hard things. And I look forward to really taking advantage of that. I also want to point out that the numbers that you see in this budget are the result of approval of a 17-member interim board with a very diverse set of interests they were representing. And it was hard work, but they scrubbed this thing hard over almost 18 months and a little bit longer than that, really, to get to these numbers. This budget really is a status quo budget from what we got approved through the interim board. We build on that agreement. The other thing I want you to know is it's been a huge amount of effort on part of staff to convert from 7 different budgets, not subject to state budget law, with all the whims of 7 different boards, the single budget subject to the state budget law that Director Mueller just shared this information with you about. All the staff had to think differently about submitting their requests. We had to do that earlier with a lot more rigor. And I want to call out Lori Baker for her incredibly hard work in pulling off all of this together. The district would not be where it is without her. Bill and his team have done an excellent job looking ahead for the capital programs and the operating costs. And so it's just been a lot of work. On-Hell has been amazing. The entire team has had to pull in, but really Lori's leadership has been instrumental, and I want you to know that. We wouldn't be here without her expertise. There are more improvements to our finances coming. You'll have more transparency. If you don't see the information in the budget that you would like to see, please tell us. We have nothing to hide, and we're anxious to give you all the information that we have if you're interested in it. I want to address a question that came to me from a board member prior to the meeting, which is about federal risk. We do have some federal risk given the changes that are happening in Washington, D.C. I want to briefly outline those, and if you're interested, we can talk more about it going forward. On the Portland Metro Levy Study, which is our partnership with the Corps of Engineers, that project is certainly going to slow down. We have a federal authorization. That authorization does not go away. Appropriations under this administration are a question. We're not sure where that will go, but we are confident in the long run that the importance of our project will receive federal investment. It's too important for the feds not to do that. We also have a pass-through grant from the city of Portland from the Federal Emergency Management Agency to replace the Portland International Raceway pump station. We're on a reimbursement basis for our work, and the city is paying our bills. If that changes, we'll let you know, but there is no risk to the district financially because of our agreement with the city of Portland. There is a risk that that project could be delayed if federal funds are not provided. We have another project called Straw Pipe Project where we're receiving federal funds through the state of Oregon. That project continues to be funded by the state, but again, there's some question going forward about that funding. When it comes to a flooding emergency, the Corps of Engineers typically isn't a key player in that. We rely on our local partners, and the Corps typically comes in after a disaster to support us. We don't know if there will be delays in disaster response under the new administration, but I think you could expect there would at least be some additional work and confusion around that. When it comes to forecasting river levels and weather, a lot of that is automated. At the same time, we rely on commercial products as well. There could be some small changes, but we think our partners at Bonneville and the Bureau of Reclamation and the Corps of Engineers will continue to give us early warning of high flow events that we need to manage. And the last is the US-Canada treaty. Right now, that's on hold. Just like before, when the treaty hadn't been completed, we've been told to expect that we could see more up and down changes in the elevation of the river, and we will likely see higher average annual flows. So what you would see is that river elevation running higher for longer. The Portland Metro Levy System study looked at that scenario, and the designs that we're working to implement address that additional uncertainty. And in the meantime, we're reasonably confident that our levy system can withstand any initial changes in flows that might come out of the delay in the implementation of the treaty negotiated under the Biden administration. So those are the things that we know about. I want to assure you that our daily operations are not impacted by these changes, and our local funding is secure and our partners support our efforts. Just today, Colin was down in Salem. That's why he's not here today testifying as we moved our 2 funding bills through Ways and Means Committee. So things are looking good locally. And last, I want to let you know that for the first time in my career here, and the first time since I think, well, at least a decade, we've increased the amount of contingency and reserves in our proposed budget. And I want to ask you to really contemplate if you want to change that, because things happen in our system that we can't predict. And we haven't had the comfort of having at least a little bit of funding that we could go to in an emergency to repair a pump or take care of something that really needs to happen. So that's what I wanted you to say. I wanted to say to you. And again, I just want to remind you that this really is the result of a decade of really hard work to get us to this place where this district has sustainable resources. So we look forward to your feedback and your guidance. And Lori, thank you for letting me go on so long and taking all of your time. But she's done an amazing job pulling this together, and we're anxious to answer your questions. Thanks.
So I do have a lot of slides. I'm going to try to go through all of them, and then we'll see how much time we have at the end for questions. So I encourage you to write your questions down. If we don't get to them today, we'll definitely get to them on April 9th. So with that, I will get started. So the district uses different funds or buckets of money to account for transactions. The Capital Projects Fund, which accounts for capital acquisitions funded by the general obligation bond, is budgeted at $18.1 million. The Debt Service Fund, which accounts for principal and interest payments on the general obligation bond debt, is budgeted at $1.3 million. And the General Fund, which accounts for everything else, including our regular operations of the district, is budgeted at $20.2 million. These costs all align with the current fiscal year budget, so there's not a lot of changes, but we'll walk through those changes as we move through these slides. So as we discussed, the general fund accounts for regular operations of the district. The budget foundation is the current year budget for operating expenditures, and we used a zero-based budgeting process for non-capital and capital projects. The general fund includes all regular operations for the district and includes that money that we have in the current year also for the new responsibilities of the district. This schedule shows you the comparison of the proposed budget for 2025-2026 to the adopted budget for this current year for our resources. So this is the money that's funding our operations. Our beginning fund balance includes estimates for our carry forward unrestricted fund balance of $12.8 million. $200,000 in carry forward capital projects from the current year, $2.8 million in funds that are designated for projects that are within the boundaries of the former Penn 2 and SDIC districts, and $200,000 in restricted funds that are mainly restricted for capital work. The projected beginning fund balance is higher than our proposed budget this year because actual fund balance carry forwards from MCDD when we merged all of the districts were higher than anticipated at the beginning of the year. And we've also had positive operations this year, so we haven't spent as much money as what we planned in the budget. Total revenue of $18.9 million is lower than the current fiscal year, and that's because we're anticipating fewer revenue dollars from grants in the upcoming year, and those grants fund capital projects. Let's take a look at the assumptions included in each of these revenue categories. So the flood safety benefit fee, which is our new revenue this year, in the amount of $6.45 million will be allocated to each jurisdiction by population. The fee legislatively can be increased annually at the higher of CPI or 3%. Given that our December 2024 CPI is at 2.7%, Lord knows where it's going to be by the end of this fiscal year, we are including the statutory 3% increase for the flood safety fee in the proposed budget. And we're going to talk later today about why we're including these revenue increases, and you'll see in the 5-year forecast that it's really something that we need to build as we're moving forward as an organization. This is the calculation that we use for assessment revenues. So we start at the very top with the current year assessment amounts for the district of $11,048,123. Don't ask me. We are including a rate increase in the budget of 3%, which aligns with the flood safety fee increase. We do not have restrictions legislatively on how much we can increase our assessments, But as we get to the bottom of this and talk about how much money it actually creates when we do a percentage increase, you'll understand that it's not a huge amount one way or the other. So we're including the 3%, which keeps the division of our revenues at the same kind of as what they are right now. So this makes our 25-26 assessments a total of $11.38 million. We have compression estimates, which we've talked about before, of $1.4 million. And this amount was actually calculated by an outside consulting firm who looks property by property and does that calculation for us to estimate how much compression will be. This brings us to a levied assessment amount of just under $10 million. We do some direct billings of our assessments. One of the larger direct billings that we do is for leased properties that are owned by the Port of Portland. And so the total that we're estimating for direct billings for next year is $1.9 million. This leaves $8.1 million that is billed by the county. The county provides a 3% discount for taxpayers who pay on November 15th or prior to 15th, which is the due date of their tax bill. And additionally, a portion of these taxpayers don't pay their bills. And so we're estimating a collection loss of 3%. So that's the 6% is both the discounts and the collection rates. So we're estimating that we will collect $7.6 million through the county. When we add back the direct bills, we're including $9.5 million as assessment revenues for the proposed budget. So for a 3% rate increase, we're estimating an additional $359,000. So we get about a little over $100,000 for every percentage increase that we do to the rate. So it's not a lot. There are $1.1 million in grant revenues funding capital projects that are included in the proposed budget. This is actually just one project. This reflects the remaining pass-through funding from the City of Portland for the PIR pump station design work. This is made up of a FEMA grant, as Jim was talking about, as well as other local match funding. All of it is provided, is passed through the City of Portland. We're working closely with the city to ensure that funding availability for the project, and we'll continue to work to ensure that we're reimbursed. The city did provide us with an advance on funding to ensure that we're not at risk in any month for the funding for the work that's performed in that month. So we got a $160,000 advance from the city to allow us to have funding for payment of invoices prior to getting reimbursed by the city. So from month to month, we have that reassurance that we'll be able to get that reimbursement. And if the city gets in a situation where they're finding that they're not able to collect on the FEMA funding, then we would know to slow down on the work that we're performing on this design of the PIR station. So given the current federal actions related to FEMA, we're aware that there is some risk that the work may need to be put on hold, but we'll continue to work closely with the city so that we'll be aware of where we're at with this project. The intergovernmental service revenue is revenue that we receive from contracts or IGAs with our local government partners. In the budget, this includes almost $800,000 from the City of Portland and another $401,000 from the Port of Portland. These are ongoing IGAs for services and also for the stormwater fee agreement with the city. This chart shows you a comparison by appropriation line for the general fund spending between the proposed budget and the current fiscal year budget. We will walk through the key assumptions related to those budget changes in future slides. You can see that there's a jump in finance and administration that results primarily from salary increases and benefit rate increases that we'll review on the next slide. Engineering and operations includes a $500,000 increase in a non-capital project spending, which includes the dredging of Salmon Creek, which is funded by some of those designated funds that we talked about earlier. Capital projects funded by the general fund have actually declined, which is reflective of our spending on the grant-funded PIR pump station design. We have included $1.3 million in contingency, which is higher to provide for possible funding for recommendations by our consultants that are currently working on the pay equity study for the district. By utilizing contingency funds for those dollars, any spending related to the outcome of that pay equity study would need board approval in order for us to do that spending. Our staff are the key to our successful operations, and as such, they make up 43% of the district's operating budget. Our projected employer taxes and employee benefits are projected to cost 62% of salaries for the upcoming year, which is an increase of 3% compared to the current budget, which is at 59%. Most of that cost is an increase in our Oregon, which has known contribution rate increases for the upcoming fiscal year, and it's actually for the upcoming biennium. So every 2 years we get new rates, and the rates have simply been going up every 2 years. We also are including pay increases in the budget as well. We'll talk about that. And at the very last, adequate staffing is the key to our success as a district. All right, let's take a look at the staffing levels. This slide shows the comparison of the current budgeted levels of staffing and the staffing included in the proposed budget. In planning, we're adding a full FTE project manager whose responsibilities will include our continued work on the equity program and support for the implementation of the district's new responsibilities. The small reductions in both engineering and planning are removal of summer intern FTEs that were last year. So we had a couple of FTEs last summer. Those haven't been included in the upcoming budget. Here you can see we're including a cost of living increase of 2.7% and a merit increase of 2%. This level of change is landing right in the middle of our partners, with some funding lower adjustments at between 3% and 4%, and others increasing employee compensation by 7% to 8%. We work hard to align with our partners, and so we do a lot of calling early on in the budget process to find out where people are landing. What we're finding is our partners that have union agreements are seeing much larger increases as they negotiate those agreements and move forward with their union employees. We will be completing the district's full compensation study to ensure that the district continues to be competitive in employee compensation. That study is currently underway. We've included funds, as we talked about, in contingency for potential compensation recommendations that we may receive as part of this study. The board will need to consider those and approve any transfers from contingency before we can implement any compensation changes that come from those recommendations. Materials and services include supplies, electricity, non-capital projects, and the $500,000 that we've set aside for new responsibilities. The proposed budget document includes detail on these costs in each of the departmental pages so that you can see specifically what each department is spending their dollars on. General fund capital spending includes the funding for the PIR pump station design work of $1.1 million that was funded by grant dollars, vehicles and equipment of $762,000, and the upgrade of the Schmier Road pump station of $560,000. The full detail of the general fund capital spending is included in the proposed budget on page 116 if you're interested in looking at that detail. The general fund debt service includes principal and interest on debt that funded capital acquisitions and interest on the line of credit borrowing from the city of Portland. If you recall, the city of Portland provided a loan that financed all of the operations of the urban district until July 1st, 2024. Payment schedules for the general fund debt are included in the budget book on page 85. We will actually start to have to pay back the city of Portland for that line of credit, not in 25-26, but in 26-27. The debt service fund accounts for all of the principal and interest payments on the general obligation bonds, and that is funded by property taxes. This schedule shows the anticipated second tranche of borrowing for the GEO bonds. This includes a tax exempt borrowing through the state of Oregon that's been approved by the IFA board. We keep moving it from month to month on the agenda because we're working to come up with the debt agreement with the state of Oregon. So I'm anticipating that you will see that debt for approval probably in May or June of this year when we get the agreement finalized with the state. This is part of that original work that we did with the state that really is taking some of the tax burden off from our taxpayers for the first couple of years of borrowing on the general obligation bond. And we're looking at a lower interest rate from the state of Oregon for this tranche of the borrowing. So we are hoping that we can finalize that agreement, move forward with it, as it will allow us to extend another year before we actually do the final public offering for the remainder of the debt. So you'll see the tax burden as it may for the property taxes is pretty low. It was pretty low for this year, and it's going to be, we are projecting that it's going to be pretty low for 25, 26 as well, as we are really containing our borrowing and making sure that we're prudent about the work that we're doing related to the first couple of years of the bond project fund. So we don't anticipate needing to issue the remainder of the GEO bonds until later in calendar year 2026. So it'll probably be in the following fiscal year. For the outstanding bank borrowing that we did this year, which was $15.7 million worth of borrowing, we've included a principal payment of $464,000 and interest of a little under $800,000 for that payment for the upcoming year. So it keeps it at a pretty low level for our taxpayers for the second year of the bond program. The capital projects fund accounts for all of the capital projects that are funded by the general obligation bonds. We're proposing $18.1 million in spending on bond capital projects for 2025, 2026. The majority of this spending, as we're projecting now, is for the PMLS projects, as well as funding needed to continue work on the Gate Tower, Sunderland Levee, and Salmon Creek. Design work will begin on the Broadmoor pump station, as well as design work for the PIR pump station 4-bay. Additionally, there's bond project administration, including a bond analyst and funding for a legal position should we need those positions. We have been delaying in the hiring of those positions until we are really feeling the burden of the full work in those areas. So there are 8 FTEs of staff included in the bond project budget, including 3 FTEs of engineer and 3 FTEs of project managers that are in planning, as well as those 2 administrative FTEs for legal and bond accounting. We're continuing to evaluate the workload needs, and it's possible that hiring for some of these positions may be delayed. For example, we're currently supporting the financial accounting for the bond with our regular finance staff. So we will make the decision at the point that it really gets to be too much of a burden for our staff. Again, we're trying to conserve as much as we can so that those dollars can go towards project rather than staff costs. We're aware of the current federal changes that may have potential impacts on the PMLS projects. Given that we're still early in the design process, the work that's included in the proposed budget is all work that needs to be continued, regardless of federal circumstances. We do have dollars in the budget for a regular cash contribution for the Army Corps of about $5 million that potentially could be delayed. We'll continue to monitor the status of the federal side of the project and keep you informed if we anticipate changes to the work plan. And we're starting to have those conversations about what things would we do instead if we're seeing slowdowns on the PMLS side. There's a lot of work in this bond. A lot of it is very important for flood safety. And so if we need to move some things forward, we have the capacity to be able to do that in this budget, and we will do so. We have a great team of engineers that are taking a look at that information and helping us to make some decisions about timing of projects. All right, the 5-year forecast. So the forecast for the district's upcoming 5 years of general fund spending is included in the supplemental data section of the budget, which is clear in the back. Let's take a look at this. There's a lot of numbers on this page. I'm sorry, but I couldn't figure out a way to make it a little bit smaller. So this is the forecast for the 5 years for the district's general fund. Starting at the top, we have the fund balance carried forward from the previous year. Here you can see the remainder of those designated funds from SDIC and Penn 2 with project spending utilizing the remaining funds in fiscal year 2026, 2027. If you recall, due to the form of revenues for the district, which are collected mainly in the second half of the fiscal year, it's important for the district to maintain a carry forward fund balance. It covers about half of our annual spending to allow for funding of costs in the first half of the year prior to that point when we're collecting revenue. In the revenue section, we're assuming an assessment rate increase and a flood safety fee increase of 3% each year. These 3% increases are necessary to ensure that at the end of year 5, we continue to have enough carry forward fund balance to fund our regular operational spending in the first half of the year. By doing this, the district avoids having to borrow money in the first half of the year for operations, which a lot of local governments do that. A lot of them do tax anticipation notes in order to continue their operations until they collect on those property tax bills. This in turn saves us money as the borrowing will have interest costs. And we looked at that with the interim board and it was pretty significant. It was really a great position for us to be in to start with those carry forward funds from the legacy districts. And we are highly recommending that we continue with that strategy so that we don't have to do that interim borrowing and don't incur those interest costs. This 3% increases for rate also align with the 3% annual property tax revenue increases that are built into the property tax revenue system. So I'm sure you don't remember all of the talk that I had about compression and property taxes, but the way the Oregon law works, the assessed value automatically increases by 3% or can increase by 3%. So pretty much automatically increases by 3% a year, which means that our local partners are basically seeing, with the exception of compression, are basically seeing a 3% increase in revenue each year on the property tax side. So by aligning with them, we're really being consistent with what they're experiencing. Grant revenues are tied to the projections in our CIP as they fund capital projects. Personnel services assumes consistent staffing with salary and benefit increases of 5% annually and include an additional 1% each biennium for that PERS rate increase that we keep experiencing. Materials and services have an assumed increase of 3% annually for CPI. Capital outlay ties to the CIP projections and debt service follows the payment schedules that we reviewed earlier. You can see in fiscal year 26-27, debt service payments increase significantly as we enter into that repayment of the line of credit funding received from the city of Portland. By year 5, you can see that our final fund balance has declined to $9.6 million. So that's down there at the very bottom. We have 9555000, which isn't quite half of our operating spending for that year. This results from spending levels that begin to be a little bit higher than anticipated revenues beginning in year 3 of the forecast, and that's that repayment of the debt service. This will be an issue that we need to continue to monitor in upcoming years. And as I noted above, it's the primary reason we're recommending those annual rate increases for assessments for the flood safety fee. Now we know, let me stop and go off my notes for a minute. We know that we're very prudent at managing our spending. You've seen this year, we've got about $985,000 in our budget for contingency and we haven't spent any of that. So if we continue to do the good job that we're doing with managing that spending, those contingency amounts are going to feed into our fund balance. So I don't expect when we get to year 5, unless some things just get out of whack for us, that we'll be at this $9.6 million. I think we will have a higher carry forward fund balance, but when you're doing these projections, you have to assume worst case. So we're assuming that we're going to spend that contingency money. I hope to work with you in the upcoming year to start to talk about some reserve policies. So when we don't spend those contingency dollars, we know in the CIP, we've got some needs for capital spending out past year 5, and it will be really helpful to start to build some of those reserves if we can. So those are all things that you can't really factor into a 5-year forecast. So this is really looking at worst case scenario for us. But I do encourage you not to feel pressure to start to spend down on that fund balance. And if you are interested in seeing some of those numbers that we projected as far as interest costs and what happens to us if we start to do interim borrowing, I'm happy to share those as well. All right, we've made it to the last slide. So let's walk through our next steps in the budget process. So on April 9th, we have a budget committee meeting to allow for additional time for those questions that you may have about the budget. I know this is a lot of information. There's 192 pages here. It's hard to kind of let all of that sink in. So as you start to dig through this, if you have questions in advance, I'm happy to meet with you. I'm happy to receive those questions and make sure that we're prepared to provide you with the information you need when we meet on the 9th. On the 17th, we're asking you as our budget committee to approve the budget. The approved budget is actually due to the TSCC on April 18th. So I'll be working late into the evening after you approve the budget on the 17th to make sure that I can pull that approved budget document together so their commissioners can review the budget and provide those questions for us in anticipation of our TSCC hearing that's on May 19th. And then the board will consider adoption of the budget on June 5th. With that, I can take any questions. We have 17 minutes.
Nice job getting through all the slides. All right, so any questions from, well, I'll start maybe with folks on Zoom since it's harder for them to get people's attention. But if there's anybody out on Zoom that has a question for Lori. Okay, not seeing anybody pipe up. So any questions from any of the directors around the table? Please, go ahead.
Lori, thank you for the presentation. If I heard you correctly in the 5-year forecast, you said it assumes salary and benefit increases of 5% each year.
Correct.
Could you talk a little bit more about how you arrived at that assumption?
Certainly. So we do have to build in some increase for medical insurance for our employees this year. So there's, between that, the medical, the dental, those insurance costs, that's about 1% of it. And so we've included a 4% increase for salaries. And that includes both COLA, merit, and any promotions that we might do for staff from year to year, but it's keeping the FTEs consistent. So there's no adds of staff. It's just that 5% to cover any benefits cost increases as well as pay increases. So it's historically, we have given salary increases that are a bit higher than that. So it is kind of a tight estimate as far as increases in cost.
Mr. PERS.
So an additional 1% for PERS each biennium.
Other questions from directors? Director Lane, you look like you've got.
Yeah.
Yes, Director Olson.
Good job, Lori. Thank you. The budget book was really good. This is the best financial condition I've seen any of these districts or a single district in, the 10 or 15 years that I've been kind of peering over the shoulder of this. So I'm really pleased with how far this has come. I have a quick question on about budget management, referencing a comment on page 28 of your budget book, and I don't need to read it, but when the board adopts a resolution to accept the budget, in here it says we're authorizing appropriations for each fund, and there's 3 funds, right?
Yes, there's 3 funds, and then
So,
within the general fund, the appropriations that are broken down by division. So those financial reports that I share with you each month that talk about the appropriation levels, that's the level of authority. So if we had, for example, if I had office supplies and printing expense within my budget, I could do money between those lines.
Right. So as long as you're plus or within the 10% change. No.
No.
So I'm thinking about, where does the board come into an authorization role at the fund level, at a change at the fund level?
At the fund level and at those individual appropriation lines. So executive director, legal, finance and administration, engineering and operations, and planning and public affairs, and debt service actually gets called out independently. So in a situation, it would most likely be an emergent situation where we had something happen where we knew that we needed to spend additional funds. We would be coming to you, and it likely would be engineering and operations because that's where our flood safety work is really happening. We would come to you as board members and ask for a budget transfer out of contingency into that division so that we wouldn't overspend our
So
budget.
at the unit level, not at the fund level. Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you.
Yes.
On the contingency front, this relates to the pay question as well. So you mentioned that there is contingency, it's thought to be used for the results of the equity findings. How much of the contingency is saved for that?
So we got a range from our consultants of between 1% and 3%, and we put the 3% in. So $360,000, which would cover the 3% salary increases plus the impact on the taxes, because there would be payroll tax increases as well. So there's $360,000. We don't believe that it is going to look like that. But we're very early in the process. So, but it's only been 2 years since we've done a full equity study. So we believe that we're still in the competitive range. There may be a couple of positions that are off, but we also put the dollars in contingency because we don't know what department that might be in. So I couldn't make any assumptions about where there might need to be additional dollars for salaries.
And Lori, for staff to access contingency, it sort of goes back to Director Ralston's question.
It has to be approved by the board. So I would come to you with a budget transfer resolution with information as to why we need that transfer, which would give you the details of how we calculated it. And you would need to approve that before we spend the money.
That was an item that I think previous interim board members were interested in as well, to make sure that on employee pay, you guys have an opportunity to weigh in on that before we just go spreading cash all around the district.
Absolutely. Yes, Chair Segment.
Thank you, Chair. I just had a question. Maybe, I don't know if it's Bill, you could just talk about the difference between the PMLS projects and then the other, the upgrades, and just kind of like how those are different types of money, and it's not super clear. How on slide 20, you've got the PMLS post budget of 9.7, and what projects are those?
Pull the slide and see if we can answer that question for you.
So this is on the general obligation bond. So of the $9.7 million that's in PMLS, it's the cash, $5 million of that is the required cash contribution to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. There are also some real estate costs that are included in that $9.7 million, as well as some just staff labor costs as they're managing the project.
Yes, Executive Director.
If I could just step back, the PMLS projects are limited by the Corps of Engineers authority. And so any projects that were within their authority, they agreed to take on as part of the feasibility study. There are also deficiencies that we found in the feasibility study that the Corps is not authorized to fix. For example, we didn't maintain something effective. That's on us. So when you look at the Sunderland, Salmon Creek, and Gate Tower projects, those were outside the Corps' authority, but identified in the feasibility study. So there are obligations. So that's how those dollars split a little bit as well. We pay the Corps, and then the Corps uses federal funds to buy contractors to do the work. So that's their share of this. I don't know whether you were at that level or whether you wanted to be at the granular level.
That's really helpful. So the PMLS are kind of, I don't know, in my terms, is kind of like more in target of budgeting, and then the other projects are kind of out of target, unexpected, or things that the PMLS would not cover.
Correct.
So our piece of the PMLS is our local match that we need to provide in conjunction to the federal funding for all of the projects that the Army Corps has identified to include within that. And if that's helpful, we can make sure to provide that information so that you know what's in versus what's out. I think we did that as part of the development for the GEO bond, but it's been a while and many of you were not participants in that. So we'll make sure and provide that information in advance of our April 9th meeting so that you have that and know specifically what's included. So it's the interesting part of the PMLS is kind of the local match work that we're doing. A lot of it is real estate work, and it is kind of, we have to do the real estate and work in advance of their procurement of the construction that's going to happen for that portion of the project. So we're kind of spending in advance, and then they come in and do their work. They also have us, our local match covers relocation costs. And that is really because we have those relationships and can work with the city to be able to do that relocation work, which is much more expedient process than what would happen if the Army Corps tried to do that work. So they look at the local relationships and they identify the pieces of work that are really going to help the project along. And that's mainly the real estate and the relocations. And then we have cash contribution requirements as well. We're giving funds to the Army Corps so that they can continue their work.
And those cash contributions, is that like on an annual basis, or like how do you know how much to give them?
There's actually a schedule of amounts that we pay them on an annual basis. And again, we're a little bit uncertain for next year because we're not sure if there's going to be any sort of a slowdown.
If you don't mind, and I'll add to that as well. I'm not quite sure what you meant by the term targets in your comments. So maybe it's referred just to the PMLS related costs. What's I think is important to highlight in this slide is that, of course, PMLS is very important for a variety of projects that both the Corps and our district feel are needed to improve flood safety. But we also know there's a number of items that have to be addressed for FEMA accreditation as well. The PMLS covers many of those, but you can see the 3 projects up on the slide that are in addition to the PMLS items that are required in order for us to gain FEMA accreditation. So they're so I latched onto the term target, and so I'm not sure if that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jim kind of explained it. Yeah, I'm just kind of like trying to visualize, like, you know, here's a bucket of money that can go for these projects. And then here, you know, what's outside of the scope of the 100 million. That PMLS is not.
Why don't we do we can pull something together that explains that a little more clearly.
Yeah, I don't need it today, but I just trying to like 30,000 foot understand the buckets of money and what projects each bucket is going to.
And Carrie did some really great work when we were developing the bond. She's even got individual sheets that talk about each of the component projects. So it's no problem to put that together.
I did want to just highlight that relocations are utilities. We have to move pipes or wires or other things, water mains, so on, and the Corps doesn't pay for that.
Very nice advice.
Thank you, Chair. I have another PMLS related question, which happy to take as follow-up on the 9th or whenever is most appropriate. So Jim, you spoke earlier in regards to the Columbia River Treaty being essentially on hold for renegotiation, and that past analysis has been that the current levee system can withstand the higher flows associated with that. do the PMLS projects assume that the treaty will be renegotiated so that flows are at a certain level, or does it assume that the treaty will not be renegotiated? And does that ultimately have potential budget consequences if the treaty is not renegotiated for some time?
Turn to either Bill or Kevin or Colin to answer. Colin, you want to start, and then we can.
Sure. Great, guys. Thanks for that question. So for the selected alternative that PMLS uses, it's a uniform level of protection that was developed with modeling for the whole Columbia River Basin. And they literally said this, while it is state secrets, because it was part of the negotiation with Canada, they had the same team that was doing the modeling for PMLS as was doing it for the negotiation. And really what they wanted to be able to know is if negotiations fell apart or if they used a different flow regime, that our levy system would be adequate. So another way of saying that is the recommended alternative assumes sort of non-treaty function of the river. So it basically allowed the federal government to be able to go in with some level of certainty that they could do the on-demand as opposed to the guaranteed flow. That was not so precise, but the fact that we.
Thank you. If I hear correctly, I think the answer to the basic question is no, it would not have potential budget consequences, right? Because it's already designed for that.
Yes.
It is my understanding that the administration's reviewing the treaty. They didn't say no or anything, but they wanted to evaluate it prior to.
Understood. I'm just mentally categorizing that in the sort of uncertainty.
Yes.
You know.
Okay. And if I could add just one more on that, where the negotiations were going and what the agreement moving forward would be an on-demand model. And so we strongly advocated and had the city of Portland, Port and others advocating that we wanted the guaranteed, but this is sort of taken into account in the design of the PMLS project that there could be the eventuality of an on-demand model, and that's what's happening.
Okay, well, we are just about out of time. I don't know if you have something quick or.
Yeah, Chair, I have one quick question. I'm around the capital resources. So, I understand there's 100 million from the feds, 150 million from the GEO bonds, and potentially 45 million from the state legislature. Is the state legislature money a requirement, or not a requirement, but is that needed to cover our share, our cost share, or is it delinked from that obligation?
So it's sort of how you think about it. The answer is
No, well, the 45 million is needed for all of the projects that we've identified for accreditation and PMLS. If we don't get the 45 million, there are projects that we would not be able to do, but we would still be able to meet our local match requirements with the federal government.
Thanks.
Okay, well, I know all of you will have lots of time to spend looking through your 191 pages between now and, what was it again? April 9th. And when we'll reconvene. And so come up, put sticky notes on pages where you have questions. And if you have more complicated questions or things that you don't think are being addressed, shoot Jim or Lori an email and say, what about this? Are you going to cover that, et cetera? With that, I think I'm going to call the Budget Committee meeting adjourned and turn it over to Chair Stegman.